Hey guys, it's Shelley, and I'm here today with another episode of Recent Reads. This is the series where I just chat about the last 10 books that I read. It's pretty chill, gather around, get a cup of tea. In the last Recent Reads, I started with a little disclaimer that I was happy I included because I felt like it was important for me to begin these videos by just making clear what my perspective on the whole practice of rating and reviewing books is. I don't believe that when I'm rating or reviewing books, I'm judging the value of a book. I think all art is inherently valuable, and I feel that every book I read is a valuable experience to me. So when I'm saying this book I give a 5 out of 5 and this book I give a 2 out of 5, I'm not saying that I think the 5 out of 5 book is more valuable to society or even was more valuable to my life. That's more just saying subjectively I enjoyed this book a lot. Subjectively, I didn't enjoy this book a lot. I don't think that the value of any work of literature is based upon the enjoyment of one individual. Like, me enjoying a book more doesn't make it a better book or a more valuable work of art than a book that I enjoyed less. And the same goes for any individual. Like, no one person's opinion is what grants or takes away the value of a book, right? So when I'm rating these books, that rating is basically how much I enjoyed the book combined with my subjective assessment of the craft, which is ultimately also subjective. What I think is very well done, some people might not like. More like, this is how much this resonated with me, this is how much I enjoyed reading it, and this is why I felt the things it made me feel. But it's not necessarily me saying this is a good, valuable piece of art and this is a bad, less valuable piece of art. I've even thought about stopping this series because I don't feel like the practice of rating or reviewing books is in line with what I feel like the purpose of literature is. Like, I feel like if a writer puts years and a lot of care into crafting something because they had something they want to say, then like, who am I as one person to be like 3.75? The numerical aspect and even the talking points I have about each book are very much me just talking about my personal experience as a reader and what I personally took away from these books, which is going to be different for everyone and isn't a reflection of the book's inherent value. So we're starting off with the last 2 books that I read in 2021, and then everything else will be stuff that I read in January of 2022. First off, we're starting with What Strange Paradise by Omar Akkad. So this book is set in 2 timelines following 2 primary characters. So Vanna lives on an island that is like a very tourist community, but she's local to the island. And Omar is a Syrian refugee. He's around 10, I think she's around 14. And he was on a ship of refugees leaving Egypt, but there's a storm and he survives and washes up on shore. And they meet, and her storyline tells what happens after they meet, and his storyline tells what happened leading up to the point that they meet. First of all, the prose of this is really like evocative and beautiful. The characters are almost characters that we only know in this moment. You know, like, we're seeing them at this one pivotal moment of time. We don't really know them outside that moment, but we almost don't really need to. In many ways, the characters are more like embodiments of ideas and reflections of potentially many, many, many different people. But they still do feel like real people. There's a balance there between making a character a reflection of an idea, balancing them with still feeling like a real person. But there are definitely a lot of very impactful, striking moments within this one. This definitely reminded me a lot of Exit West by Mohtar, which is like one of my favorite novels of all time. Not because they deal with a similar topic, like they're both about refugee crisis, but they have a similar style. Exit West and What Strange Paradise feel kind of very lyrical and almost impressionistic, while at the same time hyper-realistic about the realities of war. They both combine those 2 things really, really well. So then I read She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. So this is a historical fiction novel set in 14th century China, and we open on the main character. She and her brother are very, very poor farmer peasant children, and her brother has basically been prophesized for greatness, and so when he dies, she assumes his identity, ends up joining a monastery under his name. So we know the main character as Zhu throughout the book, and we follow Zhu following this fate that wasn't hers to begin with to greatness. Really interesting character in Zhu, and a couple really interesting side characters as well. What shines the most in this book is Zhu's interiority. And the book is the strongest when it gets close and deep into her feelings. And it's the weakest when it focuses too much on external action without her interiority. For me, the story was the strongest at the beginning when she was young and she was in the monastery, because it was focused on her inner conflict but also inner strength. The book weakened for me as we got into the war plot line, where it became much more external and we lost her internal character development. You know, maybe this is also a matter of taste, because I'm a lot more interested in like character-driven novels and like military fiction, which I'm not that interested in. If you really like military fiction, you might love this like middle section of the book that's very military. I also would have personally enjoyed more development to the romance. We love a historical sapphic romance where one character has a disguised identity and there's like a lot of gendery stuff happening. I personally would have liked more development to that relationship. For me, the middle of the book was slow because we lost the characters in order to focus on the military aspects. I think if there could have been more of a balance of interiority alongside the military plotline, I would have stayed engaged throughout. So then I read Summer by Ali Smith. This is the last book in Ali Smith's Seasons Quartet, where the books are all like interlinked, but each one is a standalone that follows different characters in a different situation. Like the rest of the series, I think that this book has a lot of really bright, interesting pockets of ideas. It has this kind of like light, breezy, philosophical tone where it's very, in some ways, dense with philosophy and idea, but it reads so airy, you know? It doesn't feel dense to read. The series just kind of floats. I don't know, something about her writing style is so dreamy. Like the rest of the quartet, nothing really happens, but also like everything happens. This book actually references the current pandemic. Like, it references things that happened in 2020. It makes sense because this series has always been about current events. Like, starting with Autumn, which was very much about Brexit. And then I think was Winter about like the Trump election. The books have always been really rooted in current events, among many other things. I wonder what her maybe original plans for this were. I don't know. Anyways, things I would ask Ali Smith if I had her phone number, which I don't. To me, this was the weakest in the quartet for two reasons. First of all, because the interpersonal situation was the least compelling, and also because the writing was less experimental, and for me, the experimental aspects of the writing and the form were what made the earlier books shine the most. Now that I've finished the whole series, Winter was by far my favorite, then Autumn, then Spring, then this one. I do really like Ali Smith's writing. Now that I'm done this series, I'm really excited to read more of her stuff. Other than the Seasons Quartet, I've only read How to Be Both, which I adore. Like, maybe it's even my favorite Ali Smith book. It's tied with Winter. Maybe Winter. So if you're like a big reader of Ali Smith, what would you recommend now that I'm done the Seasons Quartet? So then I read This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal, Mohtar, and Max Gladstone. Kind of a funny story about this. So my brother got me this book for Christmas. The way me and my brother do Christmas gifts is we basically just tell each other 2 or 3 books that we want and just get each other those books. This year, he was like, this is a book that I want, and other than that, surprise me. So I got him This Is How You Lose the Time War. He also wanted to surprise me with one of the books he got me this year, and he specifically wanted to get me a science fiction or fantasy book, and his logic was, for it to be a science fiction book that I would actually read, it has to be short and pretentious. Yeah, we got each other the same book. This book is about 2 different time agents, Red and Blue, who are agents on different sides of a time war. And they're basically both trying to manipulate time to destroy each other's timelines. They start leaving each other messages. There's kind of like back and forth rivalry they have eventually turns into a romance, and they end up falling in love. I can't think of a better concept to a book ever. Pure genius with that one. The world is really fascinating, tactile, everything is original. Like, the 2 authors, I have to commend them because I don't think there was a single point in the construction of this book that they resigned to familiarity. Like, even learning about the 2 kind of worlds they come from. I'm just gonna read what it says on the back because it's quite complicated. Red belongs to the agency, a post-singularity technotopia. Blue belongs to Garden, a single vast consciousness embedded in all organic matter. I mean, I also will admit I'm a sucker for sapphics in space. I have question. The world building is given in these like brilliant little details, but very few broad strokes. And it makes it hard to understand the mechanics and stakes of the world. I think I have to just read what I wrote here. I don't understand the mechanics of how anything works. Both time travel and the war itself. For example, why are they at war if both can clearly exist simultaneously, since you have to exist in the first place to go to war with each other? We're told only one side can exist, but they both exist now. And there are many threads of time. My theory was that at some point, like, something happened to, like, harm one of the timelines, so one would, like, cannibalize the other, but this is, like, never explained, and there are so many threads of time, so why is it that they have to destroy each other? Despite the very evocative descriptions, it's hard to picture anything because the writing can be so flowery. I never really knew where I was because the writing is so metaphorical. We're constantly dropped into new settings, and a lot of them are weird settings. Forces you to suspend a lot more disbelief than necessary. Like, if they just put a little more time into answering some of the basic fundamentals about how things worked, like what started the time war, how does the time war work, how does the time travel work, where are we, what do people look like, we wouldn't have to suspend our disbelief so much. I'm here for it to be wild and wacky and strange, but I kind of need to know what is happening. That the romance was really probably like one of the most unique love stories I've ever read. Maybe there was almost a little too much focus just on the romance and not on the world building, which is too bad because I think the world is one of the most compelling worlds I've ever read. The stakes are inherently so high, and I do think it's commendable when authors of science fiction or fantasy just show you their world and let it breathe on the page and you can figure out how it works through the story. But because the scenes are so brief and most of it's done through letters and the world is so bizarre, I think a few more things just needed to be answered concretely. So then I read The Idiot by Elif Batuman. This has been out for a while, and I don't know why I never got around to it. This book is set in the mid-90s, and we follow the main character. We just follow her throughout her first year at Harvard and the following summer. This is more a story, I would say, of questions than ideas. It's very philosophical and pondery, but it's not about the answers. This book isn't about the main character reaching conclusions. It's more just about her contemplating. Like, there's a lot of contemplation, but it feels very almost relatable. Pretty dense with ideas, but it doesn't feel dense to read. The narrative voice is very, very approachable. I don't know, it's just one of those books where, like, even when nothing was really happening, which is most of the book because nothing really happens, it all felt meaningful. It all felt purposeful. This book was able to capture this time of life. There's a weirdness to it, a confusion to it, but a lot of things that happen feel really important, even just really, really small things. I feel like she also was able to capture perfectly the odd but like hyper specific people that you meet along the way. Like, when I think about like the people that I met and hung out with or just cross paths briefly in college, and I did not go to Harvard, let me tell you, it still felt very relatable to me. Like, thinking back to like all the weird little experiences that people I met, like, she captured those types of moments, those types of experiences, those types of people perfectly in a way that I guess I related to. Even though this is set at Harvard, which is so far from where I went to college, it was probably the most relatable college narrative that I've ever read. And I'm normally not someone who reads books for relatability. Like, normally that's not really what I care about. I'm not like, oh, I need to relate to the experiences. Like, I'm reading this because it will relate to my own life. Like, that's really not why I read at all. I found myself actually like really relating to this one, and I just felt like there's an authenticity to it. Even though things are weird and strange and hyper specific sometimes, that felt so realistic. Admittedly, this book never goes anywhere. For me, the perceptiveness of the narrator, how important every little moment of her life felt, to me was really enjoyable to read and really impactful. If you need a plot and you need the books you read to go somewhere and have a direction, you probably won't like this. But if you like very meandering, momenty fiction, where there's just interest in and joy in these tiny little moments that admittedly don't really tie together, then you might really enjoy this. And I like fiction like that, so I actually genuinely loved this book. A sequel to it is actually coming out this year, so timed that perfectly. So then I read No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. At the beginning, we're introduced to a woman who is very online, and the book mirrors the format of essentially a Twitter feed. And in the second part of the book, the main character experiences a family tragedy. About a year ago, I felt like this book and Fake Accounts by Lauren Euler were being talked about a lot. Brandon Taylor released a newsletter about those two books. I'll leave a link to it. It's called like, I read your little internet novels or something. I'm really not a newsletter person. Like, I cannot keep up with any newsletters. The one newsletter that I love is Brandon Taylor's newsletter. Brandon Taylor, it didn't even write this book, but I'm just going on a rant about how much I like Brandon Taylor because he's like one of my favorite authors, but I just like what the man has to say, okay? He had released an essay about this book and Fake Accounts, and I'd started reading it and it was really compelling, but I was like, okay, I want to go read the two books. I read Fake Accounts and I kind of hated it. In retrospect, my least favorite book I read in 2021. I guess I just lost my interest in picking up No One Is Talking About This because Fake Accounts had just like really not for me. Internet novels are a hard sell for me. In the end, I actually really enjoyed this. It really does capture the absurdity and experience of being online. I felt like the form brilliantly captures what it's like to be online. And it really captures what it's like to be bombarded with this ever-shifting braid of narratives, information about people that you literally don't know anything about, while being also completely removed from it. The jarringness of it, I don't know, it was a kind of genius. It might be inherent to the topic, but there's still a shallowness to that. You know, in the first part, it was a brilliant commentary and recreation of being online, but what did I learn about the main character? What did I learn about the internet? What did I learn about myself? Ultimately, nothing. I just saw what I already knew to be true reflected in a book rather than on my Twitter feed. It was done in a brilliant, clever way. Did I say anything? Not to me. So I'm very conflicted because I think that the first part doesn't really say anything or progress in any meaningful way. It just recreates the sinkhole that is Twitter, but it does that brilliantly. Like, it's genius. For me, I felt like the first part accomplished its purpose very early on and then just continued to elapse for over 50% of the book. The second part was so emotionally impactful. The writing was impeccable. It was stunning. I would put a little content warning for the second part on like miscarriage, abortion, or not really abortion, but like lack of access to abortion. It's not said what the narrative in part 2 is about on the back jacket. I assumed it would be a death in the family. What it's about is the main character's sister has a very high-risk pregnancy and she's not able to get access to an abortion. So anyways, if that's sensitive for you, I don't think that you would know that from the back. I would give 3 stars to part 1. I did think it was brilliant, but didn't really progress. I would give 4.5 for part 2. Part 2 was stunning. So then I read Ghost Forest by Pik-Shuen Fung, the main character who as a child, her and her family moved from Hong Kong to Vancouver, except her dad stays in Hong Kong to work and earn money from the family, and so she doesn't end up with a very close bond with her dad. Later on in the book, you know, she's now an adult when her dad ends up sick and in the hospital, her kind of trying to find a connection with him before he dies. This book is really like sparse and tender. It drifts like moment to moment. The chapters are all very short, but to me it still felt cohesive, and to me I still got a very clear sense of who the characters were and what their feelings were. It felt like even though we were only shown little snippets of the characters, I felt like I got a full picture of the character through these little moments. I don't know, it's a very airy book, if I described one book, airy, but it's not shallow. You know, when books are told very briefly or very airily, very sparsely, they can feel shallow sometimes, but this one doesn't at all. It almost reminded me like a poem. White space is used very beautifully, almost in the way that a poem would. I felt like the whole novel almost felt like a poem. Character does a traditional form of like Chinese ink painting. The literary form reflected what is said about the ink paintings. Kind of said about these ink paintings that it's like you put very little on the page, but once you put something down, it cannot be taken back. And I feel like this book had a beautiful use of negative space, about being separated from a parent and then feeling like you have a cultural disconnect from your parents, feeling like you have lost the chance to bond with a parent the way you wanted, and also losing a parent. But it never felt melodramatic. It felt very humane. It's very non-sensationalized. I lost a close family member fairly recently, and this one really hit home, I think. This book also gave me for sure a book club god complex because, like I said, I read this for book club, but it was my pick. My like toxic trait is that every book club I've ever been in, I feel like I should just be in charge of picking the books. I was in a book club in high school. It was like a school club. I felt like everyone else would just try to get the book club to pick their favorite book. I would think of the group. I would think about what the group wanted, and my book picks were always the most well received. So this really did reinforce my toxic trait, my book club god complex. So then I read Rest and Be Thankful by Emma Glass. This book follows a nurse who works in a pediatric ward, and she also has some weird, freaky things going on, like with her relationship. I don't really have much to say about this book, to be honest. I really thought I would enjoy this. Like, I was expecting to love this. The writing is very intense, but so much of the book was focused on like daily hospital tasks rather than an emotional narrative. And there were a lot of points where to me it just felt like a lot of intensity without enough to back it. And I'm sure that working in a pediatric ward where like children are dying is like an incredibly intense working condition. I'm not trying to say that intensity wasn't earned. I'm sure I can't even imagine what that's like as someone whose job doesn't involve caring for children as they die, because I'm sure that that's very taxing and that is explored in the book. But I just mean there are a lot of the book is just like this character doing like day-to-day things at work. There were points where things were so intense, but it wasn't earned well enough for me at least. So I didn't really have much to say about this, to be honest. Sometimes when a book doesn't impact you, you have truly nothing to say about it. So the last book that I read was The Most Precious Substance on Earth by Shashi Bhat. The book opens on a high schooler named Nina. She goes through personal trauma, and we follow her throughout the rest of her teenage years into her adulthood. I will say, just put a little content warning for sexual assault for this one. It's not said what the event that happens is on the back jacket, so I didn't know going into this book that it would be about sexual assault. It's not depicted on the page or even really talked about. It's not talked about in any graphic way at all, so I do think it's pretty like safe read. We just know that it happens, but it's never depicted, and it's honestly not even addressed in the book, like, because the book is very much about how Nina never telling anyone about the assault shapes her. It's about how this really traumatic thing that happened to her when she was very young is never acknowledged throughout her life. What it's like for her to go through life with this like unresolved trauma that no one knows about and that she herself hardly acknowledges. Despite the very heavy subject matter, this is a really charming, funny, sweet narrative at a lot of points. Nina is a really funny character. She's one of the most realistic characters I can remember reading in a long time. She genuinely feels like a person that I could have met. I thought that the section at the beginning where she's in high school was like one of the most accurate depictions of teenagehood that I've ever read. Early section when she's in high school kind of to me felt like a YA book written for adults. Very in a teenager's voice about teenage problems, but it was so self-aware of that it felt like it was more for adults than for teenagers, right? Like it was almost too self-aware of the cringiness of being a teenager. But when you're an adult, you know that you were that cringy. Nina's just really charming, funny character, and her voice throughout is really strong. She has this really relatable, crisp, funny voice. The way the trauma is handled in the book is very unique but very realistic. It's almost never acknowledged. Lurks kind of in what is not said. I think there were a few chapters in the middle where, we're starting to get big time skips, and it kind of felt like the story was losing direction. The bridge where the story is trying to move between the early teenage section and the later adult section is the shakiest part of the book. Like, it was just a bit awkward in establishing a new direction, but overall I did really enjoy this book. So that is all for this episode of Recent Reads. As always, I want to know what you have been reading recently. Your favorite books, your least favorite books. It's okay. I always like to say this is a safe space. You can tell me about books you hate. It's alright. I love the drama. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video.